Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I will.
That one's on over there back at her podium. It's on. I was just going to announce that, but I guess we'll get started, but as you can tell, there's several announcements. So they're testing the fire alarm here at OCAMIC, so I'm sorry. They're going to blare out in the middle of your talk, and I am so sorry. But I can't control that. If you're in the room and you have a cell phone, if you could please silence it, would be greatly appreciated. Zoomers, you're muted. Please stay muted during the talk, but at the end, you can put your questions in the chat, and I'll be monitoring that for you. And Phyllis is here, and she is going to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Pam. I am delighted, je suis enamorée, to introduce Dr. Estelle Martin, who is a beautiful French woman who earned her. Okay. All right. Well, I could hear myself just fine. You're saying it's too loud? No. Okay. Okay. So anyway, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Estelle Martin, who comes to us from Paris. She's been at UF for 5 years. And she earned her BS and MS from the University Pierre and Marie Curie. You've heard of Marie Curie in Paris, and completed her PhD at the Pasteur Institute, focusing on chikungunya virus epidemiology and postdoc work at the University of Hawaii and Texas A&M. She has worked on different virus systems, including dengue, Zika, and West Nile. Since 2020, she has been an assistant professor at UF, researching disease ecology and virus vector interactions. She teaches courses on insect ecology, vector identification, and pest management, aiming to train future scientists through high-impact practices that connect learning to real-world challenges. So I hope you will enjoy her lecture, and please do turn off or silence your cell phones. She is telling us today about the effects of climate change on vector-borne diseases, especially in Florida. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me? Yes? Okay. So I hope you will not have any issues with my French accent, but if there's anything you don't understand, feel free to ask me questions. So I'm Estelle Martin, and I'm an assistant professor in the Entomology and Nematology department at UF. And my appointment is 60% teaching and 40% research. And for my research, so for my teaching, I teach mainly medical entomology. And for my research, I research vector-borne disease. And so climate change is not something that I am an expert on in any way, but it plays a big role in the epidemiology of vector-borne diseases. And so today I was asked to talk about the impact of climate change on vector-borne diseases. So, okay. So this is kind of the outline of the presentation today. So I'm going to give an introduction on vector-borne diseases. Then we're going to be talking about climate change. then the impact of climate change on vector-borne disease. And we're going to spend some time looking at the impact of temperature on the vectors and the pathogens, and also on the impact of these changes in temperature on disease transmission. And then I didn't want to leave it there. I wanted to also mention, maybe briefly if we have time, other factors than climate change that can impact disease transmission. So let's get started. So, does anyone has a definition? I always like to start with definitions so that we're all on the same page. Anyone has a definition of vector-borne disease? What? Sorry? Yeah. So basically, it's a disease that is transmitted by a vector. So what is a vector? Hmm? Yeah. And what do? So they contribute to that cycle to transmit a pathogen between humans or between animal and humans. So you know it all already. That's very good.
Please hold the questions until the end because our Zoom audience will not hear what you're saying, okay? Thank you.
Well, it's my fault because I like to ask questions when I give the talk. But so these are the definitions. So vector-borne diseases, they are illnesses that are caused by parasites, virus, or bacteria, and that are transmitted by vectors. And they affect us humans, but they also affect animals, domestic animals, and wild animals. And as we mentioned, the vectors are the organisms that transmit those diseases. And a lot of them are blood-sucking insects, but not all of them. But we're going to talk about this today. And so these vector-borne diseases that can be characterized into two, the zoonosis and the anthroponosis. And as you can see from this graph, the zoonosis, they are diseases that are transmitted between the vector, so let's say a mosquito, and an animal. So the pathogen is really being maintained in that cycle, and us as humans, we are considered as dead-end hosts. So humans don't contribute to the transmission of those diseases, but they can get infected with the pathogens. And then some of these vector-borne diseases, they are anthroponosis. And here you don't have the animal reservoir anymore, so the transmission occurs mainly between the mosquitoes and humans. So this is distribution of vector-borne disease worldwide, and it's a bit old, it's from 2005. But so, what can you tell me about the burden of vector-borne disease worldwide? Huh? No questions? Okay. So the burden is mainly in Africa, South America, Central America, and in Asia. So I had prepared a lot of questions for you, but I guess I cannot ask them. So I'm just going to go over some example of vector-borne diseases. So vector-borne diseases, they can be caused by parasite, as we said. So there are a lot of examples, and you may know some of them. So we have malaria caused by Plasmodium parasites and transmitted by mosquitoes. We have leishmaniasis, caused by leishmania parasites, and then transmitted by sandflies. We have African trypanosomiasis that is transmitted by the tsetse flies, and Chagas disease, which is the American trypanosomiasis that is transmitted by the triatomine, which are the kissing bugs. Then we also have filarial nematodes. So I don't know if you heard of any of these, but we have encocerciasis, which is river blindness. It is transmitted by black flies. And one that you may know about that we have in Florida is heartworm, that may affect dogs, for example. In terms of bacteria, one of the well-known example is Lyme disease, which is transmitted by a tick, so different kind of vector. And we also have a lot of viruses. So, for example, dengue, yellow fever, chikungunya, Zika, and West Nile. So this is a picture that I wanted to show you that was all done by one of my co-workers down at FMEL, and it shows here the diversity of mosquitoes. And so there is a huge diversity in mosquitoes. We have more than 3,500 species of mosquito worldwide, and only about 10% of these actually transmit diseases to human and animals. And then in Florida, actually, we have 90 species, different species of mosquito. So we do have quite a lot. And I wanted to show this also to make the point that not all mosquitoes are bad. Some mosquitoes can transmit diseases, but some don't. And an example is, for example, this Toxorhynchitis rutilus mosquito. You can see that the proboscis is a little bit bent like this. And it actually feeds on plant nectar. So it's like a hummingbird. And the particularity of this mosquito is that it can be used for biological control of other mosquito species. So you can see that it's a very big mosquitoes compared to others. And actually the larvae of that mosquito eat larvae of other mosquitoes. So some are pretty cool. And so, as Phyllis said, I'm focusing my work mainly on mosquito-borne diseases. And here you can see some of the major ones. So we have malaria, dengue, chikungunya, yellow fever, and Zika, and then West Nile and Japanese encephalitis here. And you can see here that we have different names. And these are different type of mosquitoes. So the main vector of diseases are species of mosquitoes that belong to the genus Anopheles, genus Aedes, and Culex. So the burden, when we talk about the burden, so malaria is definitely the vector-borne disease that impacts most humans worldwide. So here you can see in 2020, there was an estimated 241 million cases of malaria worldwide. 627,000 people died, and among these mainly were children in sub-Saharan Africa. Dengue virus, it's the #1 arboviral disease, so vector-borne disease but transmitted by a mosquito, but that is a virus. And each year you have more than 400 million people that get infected. About 100 million get sick and 40,000 will die of severe dengue. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the United States now. What viruses are endemic to the United States? Well, the first mosquito-borne virus is West Nile virus. And actually, West Nile virus, it's pretty interesting because it is an exotic virus that was introduced into the United States in 1999 from Egypt, actually. And then in 2 years, it completely spread throughout the United States. And so now you can see that we have about 28,000 neuroinvasive disease cases. So those are the severe case of West Nile only that I report here. And about 2,600 deaths. Other mosquito-borne diseases that we have here in the US are Eastern equine encephalitis, and you can see the distribution here. as well as St. Louis encephalitis virus. And so these diseases, as I mentioned earlier, they are enzootic disease, so they have an animal reservoir. The three that I mentioned here, the reservoir is a bird, and the transmission occurs between mosquitoes that like to feed on birds. And then occasionally we have this spillover of the pathogen into the human population. The other diseases that we have in the US are dengue, Zika, and chikungunya. And so these are exotic viruses that are often imported when people come back from travel, for example, in endemic area. And they come back, and then this initiates what we call local transmission. And when this happens in the US, you can see that Florida is among the states where a lot of this local transmission happens, followed by Hawaii and Texas. And so I did live in these three states, but I have nothing to do with dengue importation. So in 2016, you may recall that Zika emerged in the US. We had 226 cases here in Florida, and then a few cases in Texas. And chikungunya, I don't know if any of you really recall that virus. It's almost 10 years ago now, and it didn't cause that many cases, but again, those cases were in Florida and Texas. And so those diseases, they are also in their natural environment and zootic, so they are, but this time the animal is different. So the virus is maintained in non-human primates and between those non-human primates and mosquitoes that like to feed on these non-human primates. And same thing, we can have the spillover that will cause basically an outbreak. But when these diseases are imported in new location like the United States, we don't really have these enzootic cycles, so it's mainly transmission from human to mosquito to human. So for disease transmission to occur, what do we need? We need a susceptible host. We need a mosquito or a vector that is able to transmit. And then we need the pathogen to be present. And all of that needs to happen in a permissive environment. So this is the epidemiological triad. And any factor that is going to impact the environment can have an impact on any of these spheres. And so when we're thinking about the mosquito, the ability of a mosquito to transmit a pathogen in laboratory setting is what we call vector competence. And vector competence is pretty much like the time it takes for a pathogen from being ingested, so your virus is going to go into the midgut and then escape the midgut barriers, arrive into the hemocell, and then spread through secondary organs, including the salivary glands. And then once it's able to penetrate the salivary gland, it can be found in the saliva and then transmitted during the next bite. So, but this is one requirement that you need to have. So you need to have a mosquito that is able to transmit. If you have a mosquito species that is not able to transmit, then you won't have transmission. But this particular factor is not the only one that is important. For a mosquito to be able to transmit in nature, it will all depend on other factors, and all of these are taken in account into this vectorial capacity equation. So for example, if you have a mosquito that is very good transmitter, but is not found in high abundance, then you would not have a lot of contact between this mosquito and the human. And so even if it's infected, it may not infect a host. On the contrary, if you have a mosquito that's not very competent, but that's in really high abundance, then there would be more contact between this mosquito and hosts and more chances for the virus to be transmitted. And so you can see as part of this equation, there are different other factors than the vector competence that play a role. So there's vector density, the biting rate, and the probability of survival. And so, for example, you can see in the equation, the biting rate here and the probability of survival, they really play key roles in that equation. And this is because for a mosquito to be able to transmit, it needs to bite twice. So it needs to bite to become infected, and then it needs to bite to transmit. And so if your mosquito dies before it bites that second time, then you will not have transmission. So we see in the last 2 decades now that we have this increase in vector-borne diseases. And some of the reasons are highlighted here. So we don't always have vaccines for vector-borne diseases that are widely available. We don't always have specific treatments. And what we do have are chemical insecticides, but there is a very limited number of molecules that are available on the market. And so the mosquitoes, they were able to develop resistance to most of these molecules. So now, even if we spray, the mosquito may not be affected at all. And then there's other anthropogenic factors that play a role. And today we're going to focus mainly on climate change and some other factors. So what is climate change? Well, so there is a distinction to be made between weather and climate, right? So weather is really the conditions that are outside at a certain time, certain location. For example, it's raining today or it's sunny today, versus climate is really describe the weather conditions that are expected in a region at a particular time of the year. And so when we talk about climate change, it really describes change in the average conditions. So it could be temperature or rainfall, for example, in a region over a long period of time. And here you have the example of Alaska's Muir Glacier. This picture was taken in 1941, and this picture was taken at the same place in 2004. So you can really see this is climate change and evidence of climate change. So what are the key observations that we have for climate change? So the first one is what we call global warming, right? So this is the increase of temperature at the surface of the Earth relative to the pre-industrial period. And so as you can see, over the past 100 years or so, we had an increase of 2 degrees Fahrenheit already. And there are estimations that global temperature will continue to increase and can reach up to 7 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. The other observation that we have for climate change is the level of carbon dioxide, so CO2, that we can detect in the atmosphere. And you can see here that we have, compared to pre-industrial level, more than 50% higher rejection of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so this is a picture that was taken not by me, but in Hawaii. Actually, I went to visit this Mauna Loa, and I went to see the sunrise. But this is very famous because it's one of the few places on Earth where they actually take those measurements. So what is causing climate change and global warming? Well, we are causing it. So burning of fossil fuel like coal, oil, and gas, this leads to really high emission of greenhouse gases, that result in an increase in temperature. And so we do these things because we need to generate power, we manufacture goods, we mine, we need transportation and all those things. Natural causes, they're also responsible to a certain extent, but like volcanic eruption or the current of the ocean, for example, but these, they already existed before us, and they don't really play a role in the rapid increase in global warming that we see now. So climate change is the greatest health risk that threatens humanity, according to the World Health Organization. So we talk a lot about this increase in temperature that are going to arise or have already happened due to climate change, but it's not only that. So you're going to have more and more unpredictable weather, for example. So you can think about hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfire. You can think about extreme precipitation, so you can have more flooding or more drought. Sea levels are going to rise. We're going to have changing in our growing seasons. And you can see that it impacts a lot of our health. And the one we're going to be focused on today is vector-borne diseases. So what you need to know is that vectors and the pathogen that they transmit, they are ectotherms. So they cannot regulate their temperature like we are able to do. And therefore, any change in the weather or the climate is going to profoundly impact the biology of those vectors and pathogens. And so here you have the life cycle of a mosquito. It starts with the eggs, and then you have 4 larval stages, after which you have a pupa that emerge into an adult. And this first part of life is really aquatic, and the second part of life is terrestrial. Then your mosquitoes are going to mate. Only the female can transmit disease, and they need blood actually to maturate their eggs, and then they're going to try to find an oviposition site to lay their eggs. And so a lot of research has been done on the impact of temperature on a lot of these processes that are involved in mosquito population dynamics. So for example, you can see here the impact of temperature on the number of eggs that a female mosquito can lay per day. And you can see that you have this increase according to, that's following the increase of temperature, but to a certain point. When it gets too hot, and then you start to see this decrease. And so what it means is that you really have an optimum here for performance. And if you are below that temperature optimum, then your fitness is going to be less. And if you are above, similarly, you will have less performance. So this is true for fecundity, so the beginning of that cycle here. But temperature also affects the probability of egg to survive to become an adult. It also impacts how fast the mosquito goes from one phase to another. And so all of that, I wanted to emphasize the fact that it's not a linear relationship. So there's typically you would have more mosquitoes, but to a certain point where it becomes too hot, and then mosquitoes will start dying, basically. But temperature also can affect other factors, and you can see here those were the 2 main components of that equation that I showed you at the beginning. So the biting rate and the survival of the mosquito. And you can see here again that we have this nonlinear relationship where mosquitoes survive longer up to a certain point, and they would bite more up to a certain point. So basically this means overall that we will increase the contact between the mosquito and the host up to a certain point. And the last thing is that temperature also affects the pathogen. And you can see here is what I was describing earlier, the time it takes for a mosquito to ingest a pathogen and for that pathogen to be transmitted again is affected by temperature. So this extrinsic incubation, but also the probability of a mosquito to become infected and the probability of a mosquito to transmit is affected by temperature. And so what is the impact on disease transmission and disease distribution? So basically, what we see is that with climate change, we're going to see a redistribution of mosquito and mosquito-borne diseases. So majority of the mosquito-borne diseases, as we saw in the earlier slide, they are really located in the tropical and subtropical areas of the world. While if you increase temperature, it means that you're going to have this expansion towards the pole into regions that were historically considered as temperate region. So we're going to be expanding here upward. And then the other consequence is that we're going to see increase in temperature in higher altitude. And so these higher altitude locations are going to become suitable for mosquitoes to colonize and then for the disease that mosquitoes carry to become more widespread. So here we can see an upslope expansion. And so I just wanted to show you a few examples. So this is the distribution, the detection of dengue from 1943 to 2013. And you can see that it's exactly that. So we can start to see this dengue detection mainly in the tropical and subtropical areas of the world. And some researchers, that they can actually make prediction of where would dengue be, for example, in 2080. And so here you have a model where they show the environmental suitability of dengue in 2015, and here of dengue in 2080. And it may look the same, but it's not. And so what area really changed? So this is what is depicted here. So you have some area where there's no change. And then you have some area in blue where it is expected that the environment will not be as suitable. So you would have a contraction of the environment. And then you have some areas where these areas are going to become more favorable for dengue transmission. And I don't know if you notice here, but right now we have mainly, when I was talking about those dengue outbreak and chikungunya outbreak, it was mainly here in Florida and then in Texas, but you can see that a lot of the US is becoming red by 2080. So then I wanted just to give you example of this upslope expansion. So this has already been observed in Africa, in Nepal. So in Nepal, what they've seen is that you have this expansion of malaria vectors in the highland of Nepal. They show the same thing in Kenya with Anopheles funestus, which is one of the main vectors of malaria, and also in Ethiopia and Colombia. So this is already, we saw that impact, and it's going to become even worse later. Here, I just wanted to show you that not every vector-borne disease is going to respond the same way. So researchers, they have done analyses, like I showed you, what is the impact of temperature on the life history traits of mosquito species. So the one I showed you previously were done for the vector of dengue, Aedes aegypti. But they did the same thing with vector of malaria, which are those Anopheles mosquitoes. And what they found is that the transmission optimum for malaria is actually 25 degrees. And the transmission optimum for dengue is 29 degrees. And so here you have the current distribution of malaria. Here you have the current distribution of dengue in Africa, and then the projection. And what you can see is that for malaria, you have less red in 2080 than you have currently. So we expect for malaria to kind of see this decrease in incidence, or at least a shift. So you can see that now those purple, they become towards area where it's more in altitude, for example. But what we also see is that dengue is becoming more red. And this would be because of those differences in the optimum temperature for the transmission. And so the same research group, they have done that for a lot of vector-borne diseases. And so here you have dengue and Zika. We have the malaria in green, but we also have, for example, Eastern equine encephalitis, Western equine encephalitis. And so you can see that for each one of these diseases, you have a certain temperature optimum. And so the way that climate change is going to impact the transmission of this disease is really going to be dependent on where we are, where you live. If you live in a place where temperature is low, a 2-degree increase may not have a lot of consequence. So you may see a little bit more transmission. But if you live in a place that's a little bit higher, then maybe a 2-degree change will have this drastic consequence of the transmission of this pathogen. And then if you're already in the pathogen transmission optimum, then you may not see a lot of change. And then like the example for malaria, if you go above this optimum, then you will have less transmission. So we talked a lot about temperature because temperature is what has been the most studied in terms of factors that impact vector-borne diseases. But remember, in that life cycle, a lot of the life cycle is aquatic. So the mosquito, they need water. And so rainfall and humidity are going to be influencing also the life cycle of those mosquitoes. And so flood and drought as well should be taken in account. So now, how much time do I still have? 10 minutes. I wanted to take the rest of the time to talk about these other factors that we need to consider beside climate change. And so the first one I wanted to mention is really globalization. And so you saw this even for other pathogens like COVID. It's the fact that people are able to travel this fast that leads to the pathogen being able to be spread. So it's the same thing for vector-borne diseases. So vector-borne diseases, through human mobility, you can have a lot of infected individuals that arrive into a new location that already have the vectors, for example. You can have introduction of vector species into new location. And so globalization really plays a big role. And one thing I didn't mention is that vector-borne diseases, they are diseases of poverty. So when the disease emerges in a new location, usually it would affect lower socioeconomic population. And so socioeconomic and human behavior play a big role. People don't always have access to healthcare. People don't really have good quality housing that can protect them from those vectors, or they cannot, always afford to pay for vector control, for example. And so I wanted to show you this example of malaria. I don't know if you remember, but this was a big deal back in 2023. There were 10 cases, locally acquired cases of malaria in the US. This didn't happen in the last 20 years. And most of those cases, they occur, of course, in Florida. And then there were some in Texas, Maryland, and one in Arkansas. And so then the other factors that play a role in vector-borne disease are linked to land use and land cover changes. So deforestation, agriculture, livestock, urbanization, mining, and the construction of dams, they all have impacts on vector-borne disease transmission. And it's not always an increase. It can be an increase or a decrease, but most of the time it's an increase. And this is mainly due because it affects the density and the presence of certain vector species. It facilitates the contact between humans and those infected mosquitoes. And so I just wanted to go over a few examples. So here is example of rice cultivation in Africa. And so they did this meta-analysis where they compare malaria transmission in villages that grow rice versus villages that do not grow rice. And what they saw is that post 2003, so when there was this big effort to reduce malaria and to distribute bed nets and all of that, what they saw is that there was this increase in malaria associated with rice cultivation. This is something that we also see for Japanese encephalitis virus, for example. And here it's two things. So it's rice cultivation and pig farming. So Japanese encephalitis virus, it's actually a virus that naturally is transmitted between mosquitoes and birds, like wild birds and water birds. And the creation of those rice fields really provided with a great breeding sites for those mosquitoes, which happen to also like to feed on pigs. And so here you have an example where you go from a wild animal to a domestic animal and then to humans. Here are examples of studies where the construction of a dam resulted in an increase in malaria. So this is a meta-analysis. And among all the papers that they summarize in this meta-analysis, only one was shown to not have an influence on malaria prevalence. Gold mining, so we talked about mining earlier. Gold mining, versus, whereas it's legal or illegal, also affects malaria transmission. And this is because you have those alluvial mine golds that really leave standing water, and then the mosquitoes are able to use that as breeding sites. And deforestation, so here you have a picture of deforestation in the Amazon. And again, here I'm showing this meta-analysis study where they show that 56.5% of the mosquito species that are favored by deforestation actually are confirmed vector of human pathogen. So you can see them all here. So here you have all the species of mosquitoes that are favored by deforestation versus unfavored for deforestation. And the color means that they are human vector of human pathogens. So you can see definitely more red here than you can see here. And what they also notice is that the species that are able to transmit several human pathogens are actually favored by this deforestation. So the last one I wanted to cover is urbanization, and I just wanted to share one study that we did in my lab so that it's maybe a little bit more close to home. So we did this study in Alachua County. We selected 3 different habitats, so a forested habitat, a suburban habitat, and an urban habitat. And we had 3 sites per habitat for a total of 18 sites. And we put these different mosquito traps every month for 2 years. We did overnight trapping, and this is my previous master student, that was his project. And all the mosquitoes that we collected, we actually identified them using keys. And what we found is that we collected more than 18,000 mosquitoes across 11 genera and 28 species in our study. And you can see here like the different species, and a lot of these are actual vector of human disease. What we saw is that we see a overall decrease in total abundance linked to urbanization. So in purple here, you have the forested habitat. In blue, you have the suburban habitat, and in green, you have the urban habitat. And we did this in the 2 different seasons, so dry season versus wet season. And what you can see is that with urbanization, regardless of the season, you have less mosquitoes. So this is a good sign. But what we also saw is that when we compare the biodiversity, so the diversity of mosquito species, actually the highest diversity was in the suburban habitat, then followed by forested and then urban habitat. And we think that this is because in suburban habitat, you have both mosquito species from the forested habitat and the urban habitat that can really live in those suburban habitats. And we found that again during the dry and the wet season. But also what we saw is that when we started to look at individual species, so the main vector of yellow fever, Zika, dengue, and chikungunya, which is Aedes aegypti, was significantly higher in urban settings. We also saw the same thing for Culex quinquefasciatus, which is the main vector of West Nile, St. Louis encephalitis virus, and Western equine encephalitis virus. And so, although we see less mosquito in urban setting, less diversity, but we see more of the mosquitoes that are responsible for transmitting diseases. So the conclusion is that climate change and other anthropogenic factors, they already and they will continue to impact vector-borne disease transmission. And also I wanted to make the point that it really depends on the system, which vector-borne disease you're interested in knowing more, and the location in which you currently live. So there could be an expansion, a contraction, or shift, or there could be no impacts. And so what should we be doing? So we should try to limit the impact of climate change. We should try to limit land use transition, or if we cannot do that, at least have plans for managing mosquito vectors. As I mentioned, vector-borne diseases, they are often associated with poverty, so more equitable infrastructure, higher quality of housing, access to pipe water and sanitation can play a big role. And we can do surveillance of mosquitoes and diseases, so know what mosquito do we have where and when are they abundant, so that if a pathogen is introduced, you already know the hotspot where you should be treating. And we should continue progress on developing new vaccines and treatments. So these are all the papers that I compiled for this presentation. And let me know if you have any questions. So, yeah.
Thank you very, very much. That was very interesting. read that mosquitoes can evolve fairly rapidly to changing conditions. So one of your graphs showed that an assumption, well, one of your graphs showed the optimal temperature for malarial mosquitoes and the optimal temperature for dengue mosquitoes. And there was sort of an implicit assumption that as temperatures warm, we would lose more of the malarial mosquitoes. But mosquitoes evolve to adjust to their environment. So maybe we'll just get more of both. Questions
Yeah,
from the audience? Yes. I'll go here first. And lady in white, did you have your hand up? Not me?
Thank you very much for your presentation. Um, it, it sounds as though your research focuses on mosquitoes as the vector for the most part. So I'd like to just share some information about tick-borne illness or syndrome that's going around here in Alachua County, because I have it, and it's been very tricky figuring out about it because nobody seems to know about it. But I don't know if you're doing research at UF, if any of your colleagues are, but it's called alpha-gal syndrome.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've heard of it, and it's
So it's the
spread.
bite of the Lone Star tick.
It's the Lone Star tick, and it's, I guess you wouldn't say it's a disease because it's an allergy, so that's a syndrome, but it makes a person have a severe allergic reaction to mammals and mammal byproducts. It's the #1 cause of anaphylactic shock in adults. We estimate that there's 500,000 people in the United States that have alpha-gal syndrome. 78% of physicians don't have it on their radar and they don't know about it. To find out if you have it, you can have a blood work done at a lab, but there's no reporting requirements to tell the health department or the CDC. So it's difficult to know for sure how many cases there are. So anyhow, I'm just wondering what you know about it and if there's any.
Yeah. So it's really interesting because actually tick-borne diseases, they're the #1 vector-borne disease in the US. But we focus a lot of the funding focused until now mainly on mosquitoes. But this has changed, and so the CDC has dedicated funding towards vector-borne diseases, for a very long time. But the last call that they had really had this switch and this interest into tick-borne disease. So hopefully more and more researchers are going to be doing work. The burden of tick-borne disease is less in Florida. So I think that's why also a lot of the research are focused more on maybe mosquito-borne disease in Florida. But yeah, the alpha-gal syndrome is caused by the bite of a Lone Star tick, and it's allergy to the saliva of the Lone Star tick. And I don't know how many people are doing research on that right now. Yeah. I always thought like this would be very difficult for me to contract this and not be able to eat meat or,
More than just eating meat, though. There's mammal byproducts.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing this. Yeah. Yeah, so what you can do to prevent tick bites is really wearing long pants, long sleeve when you go outside. If you go on a hike, try to stay on the path. Don't go into the tall grass because that's where the ticks are. And I think for the pets also, if you can give treatment to your pets. So those are the main, personal protection that you can do to avoid that.
I wanted to ask, what effect do these diseases like a plasmodium and chikungunya viruses and things, have on the mosquitoes themselves, and why haven't they evolved resistance? If it has an effect, and I don't know if it does, why haven't they evolved resistance to these diseases?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Actually, I studied some of that during my PhD. So, you know, vectors for the longest time, they were just considered as syringe to transmit those viruses, and we didn't think that they would get any impact of the infection. And there is starting to be some evidence that the mosquito can, you know, suffer from the infection. So I will take the example of chikungunya virus and Aedes albopictus. When they get infected, so we saw that, but for a very specific population of Aedes albopictus in Réunion Island, when the Aedes albopictus got the infection, actually the survival would be greatly reduced. But this was balanced by laying eggs earlier. So the mosquito, they always try to maximize the next generation. So they could sense the end, and therefore they were laying eggs earlier. And so the next generation of mosquito was still, you know, able to hatch and everything. Yeah.
The mosquito populations seem to go up as you go north. In other words, the subarctic, the tremendous density of mosquitoes. The paradox then being that there really aren't any vector-borne diseases associated with them. Is that because of the species of mosquitoes or the lack of transmitting infected females, or why is that? But clearly, if you go to northern Canada, they darken the sky. So.
Yeah, so I think it's different species of mosquitoes. So as you saw, there's a lot of diversity and not all of them transmit disease. And they kind of emerge like all at the same time when, you know, the soil gets flooded, basically. So we have a lot of what we call these floodwater mosquitoes also in the US. So for example, after a big rain event, like you're gonna have thousands and thousands of mosquitoes that are gonna emerge at the same time. And sometimes it's even reported in the news because some species can exsanguinate, for example, a cattle. So it really depends on the species of mosquitoes. So, but yeah, floodwater mosquito, they tend to all emerge at the same time. Versus some mosquitoes, they kind of always hatch.
The very first comment about the curves showing the optimal ranges for dengue and malarial vectors, the temperature ranges, and noting that insects do mutate and adapt. Did those models that we're predicting include, take that into account?
No, they don't. But what they're working on right now is to really look at, so these models, I only showed you one model, but there's like different models according to if we do something about climate change or if we don't. So for example, if we do reduce CO2 emissions and you only have a certain degree increase, you know, you will have one situation. And then if you do nothing, you will have a different situation. But so far, this model, they haven't included if the virus mutate and becomes maybe more tolerant to warmer temperature, or, you know, if the mosquito mutates. Yeah.
Okay.
I saw from your graphs that most of these diseases have a very low death rate, except for, I think, Eastern equine encephalitis, perhaps, which has about a 50% death rate in the cases. How about something like bubonic plague? Is that transmitted by mosquitoes? That has a very high death rate.
Yeah,
and
so
I wonder if any research is being done on that type of thing.
it's
that
fleas. Yeah.
Mm.
You know, there's very little research being done with fleas. I think it's because they're like so small and, you know, probably difficult to rear. So yeah, there are some groups that are doing research, but yeah.
Thank you for your very informative talk. I have a question on West Nile disease. I remember reading an article by Tony Fauci, and he was infected by that in 2024. And it apparently had some neurological impact on him. And it was probably, he was lucky where he was located, but people wouldn't necessarily diagnose that disease in other parts of the country.
Yeah, so West Nile disease, it can cause encephalitis, so inflammation of the brain, when the virus is able to cross like the blood-brain barrier. Most of the time, though, people will be asymptomatic, but if you do become symptomatic, then you have higher chances to have those more severe form of the disease. Does that answer your question, or? So in Florida, actually, we don't have as much human cases. So we know the virus is here because we have this Sentinel chicken program across Florida. And they find a lot of positives in birds, in those chickens. So we know that the virus is circulating, but somehow we don't have a lot of West Nile in Florida. So in that regard, like if you go back to the map, Florida was actually really light in terms of case numbers. And it could be, you know, it's different vector species in different region of the US. And also maybe people spend more time indoors here because it's just so hot. So we have less contact with the mosquitoes. West Nile is also a disease that influences more, that affects more older people that spend more time in their yard and that have more contact with infected mosquitoes.
I'd like to go back to the alpha-gal that she was talking about. I tested positive for that, and I'm convinced that I got it from chiggers, not a tick bite. And I know my gastroenterologist disagrees with that, but I found some research on the CDC website that said that there's an indication now that chiggers can carry that. And I experienced chronic diarrhea about 2 days after I had at least 20 chigger bites, foolishly, but that's beside the point. So I think people need to be aware and look, it's not just ticks, in my opinion. And I wrote up my case study and submitted it, but I know that's where I got it. The second question I have is, and this is a question, not a comment. Do you know anybody that can take a tick that I have, that I kept, that bit me and I had a very bad reaction to it? Can I have it tested for whether it's carrying any of the pathogens? Because I don't know whether it's because it stuck something in me that I'm allergic to or whether there's something more going on.
Yeah, actually there is a group up north that tests tick so they would give you the identification of the tick and if it was infected with any pathogens. And I can find the website and give it to you. So you can just, if you kept it, you can just send that to them and they will test it for you. And so one point I wanted to make regarding chiggers. So, you know, like, I don't know about this research that you're talking about, but it's the same thing for mosquito-borne diseases. So you can find a mosquito species infected because it took a blood meal on an infected person. It doesn't mean that mosquito can transmit, because you remember everything that I said about the vector competence. If the virus or that bacteria or whatever cannot replicate inside that particular species, then you will not, it would be excreted and you will not have transmission event. So what do we need to tell that a certain species is a vector is that it has to be present where the disease is. You have to have contact between the vector and the host that carries the disease. You have to find infected vector in the field, and you have to demonstrate in the lab that this particular insect can transmit. Finding an infected mosquito or chigger with a pathogen is not enough to claim that they play a role in the transmission. So you have to, it's a start, but you have to do all the other detective work to see if really they play a role.
Well, okay, there's a question on chat. If the U.S. actually pulls out of the World Health Organization, what would be the impact on these mosquito-borne diseases in Florida and elsewhere?
This is a good question. I don't know what's gonna, we need funding to do the research. So without funding, it's hard to make progress. I had 2 grants that I submitted to the NIH. One, there's no study section, so nobody is there to review the grants. So therefore, even if it was maybe not going to be funded, now I know it's not going to be funded.
I'm concerned about USAID no longer funding malaria control, malaria treatment and malaria mosquito control.
And climate change, so that's also.
Anyway, so I think there was another question on chat that was up above. The other one? All I could see was the last line. What is known about the pheromone detection system of male moths? Oh, is that from that's from a previous talk. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Dr. Martin, for a
having
very
me.
informative